I hope that today's show finds you all in good health and ready for more unexplained phenomena. In today's episode, we're going to forego our typical format and offer up yet another batch of listener stories. Over the last week, our inbox has been inundated with interesting encounters, and it seems only appropriate to give them priority over our next topic. So I hope you enjoy the following 9 listener accounts involving the supernatural and the bizarre.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast. I am your host, Nick Ryan. Before we start the show, I want to say thank you to our wonderful patrons, Robin, Cassandra, Julie, Courtney, Tiffany, Tom, Stephen, Mystica, Carly, and our 2 newest patrons, Kyriakos and Yukneka. We truly appreciate your support and generosity. Our first story of the night comes from Tori. Tori says, "When I was about 7 years old, I had my older cousin over for a sleepover. As I was showing her around the house, she pointed out an image of a football team's cheerleader with a signature on it, so I took it down for her to view. A few minutes later, we left it on the couch and left the room for a snack. When we walked back into the room, we found the image ripped, and I questioned her and asked why she did it. She told me she didn't, so I tried to figure out who did. So we locked the animals in one room, but when we came back out, it was ripped up even more. We went outside to show my mom, and she said to just throw it away, but we were curious how it got ripped. Each time we left the room, it was ripped up even more. We still are unsure of what ripped the image." Our next story comes from Jessie. Jessie calls their story Strange, Colorful Lights. Jessie says, "I currently live in North Carolina, where I just moved. I've always been spiritual my entire life, and I can feel bad spirits. I'm also the type of person who always looks up at the stars, waiting for something to happen. So this wasn't really much of a scare to me. When I stayed in Virginia, my cousin and I lived in the same neighborhood, so we'd always walk back and forth to each other's houses at all times of the day. One night she came over, and she looked a little frightened. Not the type of frightened that she was just chased by a serial killer, but she seemed uneasy and confused. It took her a few seconds before she asked if I wanted to come over to her house to play Mario. I said sure, and we started walking. It was nighttime, so we stayed close and under the streetlights. When I asked her what was up because she seemed off, she said that her sister, her, and her mom saw weird, colorful flashing lights when they came back from getting pizza about 2 hours earlier. It was now 10 p.m. I was excited and asked her all types of questions, like if she saw an actual aircraft, and she shook her head and said it seemed like it was coming from the field behind her house, even though when she looked back there wasn't any type of party or projector. I watched stuff on this all the time, so I was excited. That was until we walked up to her house, and I saw them. Colorful, low-opacity lights, huge, just flashing in and out of the sky. My cousin is a joking person and always turns scary situations into something funny, so she gave me a nervous laugh while grabbing my arm and saying she didn't want to get kidnapped by aliens, so we should go inside. I pulled away and just stared at them. I didn't know how to feel. Every once in a while, when I went over to her house at night, we'd see the lights. It's all field and forest park that's closed at that time behind her house, so it can't be from some type of party, and I'm sure that party lights don't look like that. Do you know what this is? If any of our listeners have experienced anything similar to what Jessie saw, please let me know. I'll be sure to add it to a future episode. Our next story comes from Jacob. Jacob calls their story, In Bed with Evil. Jacob says, Hi, Nick. I've been listening to your podcast this morning at work, and sleep paralysis has been a topic several times on your show. I haven't really shared my experience this much with people, but hearing the stories made me want to share. I have nearly forgotten about this, but when I started listening to the stories, everything just came back to me. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was living with my family. One night, I just shot up in my sleep. I was in a panic and covered in a cold sweat. I had no memory of a dream or any idea what woke me up so abruptly, but I just had to get out of my room. I sat in the front room and watched TV for a few hours until I calmed down. Then I eventually went back to bed. After a few weeks, I forgot about that night. A few months later, I woke up, but this time, instead of shooting up in bed, I was frozen in place. I was in a state of fear I have never felt before in my life, and I was unable to move. My eyes were stuck closed, but I could feel a presence lying on the bed behind me and holding me in place. I couldn't see anything, but I knew that it was there. The thing that stood out most from my memory is how cold I was. I felt like I was freezing, and I could feel my body shaking from how cold I was. I suddenly realized that the only way to stop this, or to escape it, was to attack it. I don't know why I thought this, but I just realized that I had to fight. It felt like I fought to move for a while, but eventually I swung my arms around as hard as I could to hit this thing behind me, but instead of hitting this creature, all I hit was the CD player on my bed. I sat up and looked around my room. It was empty. It was daylight out, and the room was bright, even though it seemed dark before. But even though it was over, my body still felt cold, and it took me a while before I felt warm again. After I got up and out of the room, I told my family, and they just shrugged it off, and said it was just a dream. I haven't experienced anything like it before or since. I never had any other case of sleep paralysis. I've always had strange dreams, but nothing as disturbing as that. I don't necessarily believe in ghosts or demons, but I might believe a little more now. Thanks for reading, Jacob. Our next story of the night comes from Gary. Gary calls their story, October 2018, Queen Mary Ghost Encounter. Gary says, My parents were celebrating their 65th wedding anniversary in October of 2018, and they invited all of the immediate family to celebrate an overnighter on board the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. The Queen Mary is notoriously known as being haunted. The family consists of my siblings, our children, and their spouses. I think we had about 27 family members attending. My wife was well aware of the ghost stories surrounding the Queen Mary, and was seriously considering not going for that reason. I convinced her that we couldn't let our family down, and that there were no ghosts, and that she had nothing to worry about. My wife and I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old daughter, and all 4 of us were in one room together. My parents had arranged for a ghostly tour the evening we arrived. We were the last ones to arrive, and the family was awaiting us at the meeting location where the haunted tour was. As we approached the family, I yelled out, "Is everybody ready for a ghostly encounter?" Everybody said no, except me. I yelled out, "Well, I am." We proceeded to take the creepy tour without any incidents. After the tour, we had about an hour to relax before our dinner reservations. We went to dinner, socialized for a while, and then called it a night. About an hour after we went to sleep, I felt the sheets and blankets being torn from the bed. My wife was facing away from me and quietly said, "What are you doing?" I said nothing as I pulled the sheets and blankets back over us. I looked around and saw nothing. My adrenaline was flowing as I laid back down, thinking, what the heck is going on? I started to laugh to myself, thinking, oh my God, this ghost thing is real. After a few moments, I felt someone sit down on the bed behind me. This freaked me out, and I completely froze, and I couldn't get myself to turn around. I was contemplating waking up my wife and daughters and getting the heck out of there, but I didn't want to scar them for life, knowing ghosts exist and can physically interact with you. So I laid awake for another hour before I fell asleep again. Next, I was awakened by the sound coming from the next room over of a man and woman making love. They became louder and louder until it woke up my wife and my daughters. My wife was so angry, she pounded on the wall to let them know that we heard them, and just like that, it got quiet. The next morning, we had to get up early for breakfast, so my wife decided to turn the TV up super loud to pay back the couple in the next room. When I went to the front desk to check out, I made a complaint about the thin walls and the people in the room next to us. The woman behind the counter told me that no one was staying in the room next to us. My jaw almost dropped as I explained what we had heard that night, but the clerk was adamant that no one had stayed in the room. That's all I got, and I want to thank you for the great work that you do. I really enjoy your podcasts. Our next story comes from Sebastian. Sebastian calls their encounter in a Cemetery. Sebastian says, Dear Nick, I've listened to your podcast for weeks now, and I've nearly made it through all the episodes. Thank you for your work and effort. My story is slightly different from the usual ones, but I think it's worth sharing. Although I am from Germany, the unusual event that happened to me took place in Warsaw while visiting friends in the beginning of 2019. It was a beautiful and sunny day as we were visiting the biggest and oldest cemetery in the city. I was stunned and speechless seeing those super old graves and crypts from the 18th century till today. My friends were walking about 60 feet behind me when suddenly one big piece of pollen passed my head from behind. I was perplexed because I've never seen such a white, big and roundly shaped piece of pollen in my life, but it was drifting gently through the air. Immediately, I was looking up to check if there was any other pollen flying around, but there weren't any. Due to the fact that this was the beginning of the year, it should have taken another 2 months for spring and flying pollen to come out, so it was kind of odd. Something inside me said that I needed to follow this thing, and I did. The cemetery is really huge and has lots and lots of small corridors. So I followed the pollen, and after about 10 seconds, it turned right into one of the hundreds of corridors. I hesitated, but turned right to see where it was going, and it was a section of really old graves from the 19th century, and I could see that the pollen was heading to one particular grave with a small fence surrounding it. I wasn't afraid or anything, but I was somehow curious. In my heart, I knew that this must be something important, like a sign, so I followed the pollen slowly. It touched the fence and landed exactly at the bottom of the tombstone. I didn't know what to make of the situation, but I also didn't rush to check the tombstone's inscription. When I finally stood in front of the grave, I could see that due to weathering over the centuries, I could just make out one single word on the tombstone. All the other words were unreadable or completely gone, and I noticed there were once plenty of words written on it. When I read the word that was easy to decipher, I froze, and then I turned around just by reflex to check if anybody there was watching. The only readable word was Sebastian, my name. I was stunned, but I didn't feel any fear. I was still curious. We stayed in the cemetery for another 2 hours, and I was checking every single tombstone I passed, but none of them had the name Sebastian on them. It seems that this name is pretty rare in Poland. I didn't believe in coincidence. I didn't really know what to make out of it until I talked to a friend about 9 months later, in the end of 2019. She stated, "Of course it was a warning sign that you were going to die." I replied that I hadn't died yet, but she stated, "No, not physically, but mentally," and then it hit me. I felt the truth in her words. Last year was the toughest year of my life. I struggled a lot, and I fell into a depression, and it kind of felt like dying, like my ego was slowly drowning. When my friend stated that, I immediately felt the truth in her words. Today, I'm fine again. Everything turned out to be better than ever before. I feel that someone or something was sending me this sign, to be warned, and to stay on track, and keep my belief. Thank you for reading my story, Sebastian. Our next story of the night comes from Peyton. Peyton calls their story, Missing Time. Peyton says, "Before I start this story, I would like to say that I'm not someone who has had this stuff happen to them frequently. As a matter of fact, this is one of the only encounters I can recall, and as minor of an encounter as it may seem, I still question what really happened to this day, 8 years later. When I was around the age of 8 or 9, I had gone to the grocery store with my mom, like any other normal child. Keep in mind, I had gone to this grocery store many times before, and nothing like this had ever happened. I remember my mother and I were walking down the meat aisle. I was holding on to the side of the cart, walking next to her. Nothing weird was happening. It was just a normal day. Then suddenly, for a millisecond, everything went black. I couldn't see, hear, or feel anything happening around me. It was like I was just floating in space. As soon as it happened, it was over. I could see again, and feel again, and everything was normal, except for the fact that I was now on the other side of the store. In that small little millisecond, I had somehow gotten to the other side of the store, and was standing on the end of a random lady's cart. Now mind you, I was only 8 or 9, and for some reason I hadn't acknowledged the fact that I was in some random aisle, so I thought this lady was my mom at first. Then when I looked at her, she looked just as confused as me, and considering I had just appeared on her cart, she was fairly shaken up. I put the pieces together and realized what had happened, so I got off the cart and ran to where I had last seen my mom. She was in the same position, looking at the same thing, in the same place, where she was before I appeared across the store. Now keep in mind that to get to the aisle I was in, it would have taken at least a minute of walking, and somehow I had gotten there instantly. I ran up to her to tell her what had happened, and she didn't think anything of it, because I was a small child, and how would I know what had occurred? But to this day, I remember that encounter so vividly, and still cannot figure out what had happened. Our next story of the night comes from Liliana. Liliana calls their story, Doppelganger Tale. Liliana says, "Hi again. I wanted to share a story. One day I was alone in the bedroom with the light off. My boyfriend and I had just finished the Paranormal Activity movie, and my boyfriend had a habit of pretending to be possessed to spook me. Well, this time he was playing a game in the other room. I heard it turn off, and I thought that I'd heard the door to the bedroom open. I woke up and looked at the door. The light was still off. In the darkness, there was my boyfriend in shadow, just staring at me like he was pretending to be possessed. I told him to stop joking around. He just stared at me for what seemed like several minutes. He then stepped up to the foot of the bed. He stopped there and slowly sank down. Now this isn't abnormal for my boyfriend, so I sat up and crawled to the edge of the bed and told him to stop and come to bed. At the foot of the bed, I just stared. He wasn't there. I yelled his name, and the door opened again. There was my boyfriend. He had not been the man at the foot of my bed. I started to shake and cry as I told him what happened. This was just the start of the crazy things that happened to me since. I can share more stories next time. Thanks for reading this." Our next story comes from Gabi. Gabi calls their experience, Bloody Jacket. Gabi says, "Hey Nick, I love your show, and I want to tell you some of my family's encounters. Before starting, I want to clarify that I do not live there, and these are not my personal experiences. My family lives in Southern California in the high desert, and if you've ever been in the high desert, you know how sad and creepy it is. You just get this weird vibe that I can't explain. Crime is high here, and a lot of the houses are not well kept, so the cities here look really depressed. Well, my family moved there around 3 years ago to this tiny house surrounded by 2 acres of land. When they bought the house from the previous owner, he had a lot of old cars that weren't under his name, random tiny sheds scattered around the property, weird random cement blocks in the ground, like sidewalks, but scattered and didn't flow or match up. There were also big pits around the property. Towards the end of the property, there were some chicken coop houses, and underneath the floor, there was a huge basement, and in one of the sheds closest to the house, there was a hidden crawl space under the floor. Although we never found anything weird in these sheds or pits, and we never actually dug up the pits, but you just got this eerie feeling that something has happened in this property. You know how I mentioned that there are random blocks of cement on the floor? Well, there's dozens of names written all over these cement blocks, and you can tell that whoever wrote it was the same person because the handwriting is all the same. Even though I never suspected anything of these names, I only started getting suspicious when my dad found a child-sized denim jacket with red sleeves and Sesame Street characters on them, hidden in the house. My dad was inside the house renovating it, and he was checking out the house's installed wall heater because most of these nowadays don't work, so he wanted to see what was up with it. He noticed that on top of the heater there was a built-in squared space covered in duct tape. My dad took out the duct tape and noticed someone basically made a square hole in the wall, and inside it was a plastic bag. Inside the plastic bag was a bloody, vintage, probably early 90s, child-size denim jacket with Sesame Street characters on it. When everyone saw what it was, they immediately wanted to call the police, but they got scared something would happen to them, so they just threw it away. Once they told me about it, a lot of things started making sense, especially those names written on the cement. At first, I thought it must have been his family members' names, but then I started reading them and noticed that all these names don't have the same last name. Could these have been victims too? I don't know. When I started putting all of the things together, I started staying up all night looking up missing children from the high desert area, from around the 90s, in hopes that one of their descriptions would match the jacket my family saw, but my research never led up to anything. To this day, I wish I knew what had happened and why this jacket was hidden away like that, and what other things must have gone on in this property. The reason I decided to share this now is because one of my cousins can see spirits, and said that he can see a scared little boy walking from where the heater was to the dining room and then disappears back to where the heater is. Could it be him? I don't doubt it. Thank you for taking the time to read this long story. I would love to know your thoughts and your audience's thoughts. We have a lot more stories coming from my family's house after they found that jacket. Let me know if you're interested in hearing about it. Thanks a lot. Our last story of the night comes from Tracy. Tracy calls their story An Encounter with a Native American Demon. Tracy says, "Hey Nick, I just found your podcast the other day and I'm hooked. Thanks for all your hard work. So to preface this story, it's relevant to know that myself and a few of my cousins, who are part of the story I'm about to tell, are practicing witches, warlocks, pagans. Some of us, including myself, have intuitive gifts. My cousin Morgan is very in tune with the paranormal. She sees and hears spirits often. I am an empath, so I pick up on different types of energy very easily. Now, here's my story. Ever since I can remember, my family and I have spent every Easter up in the Poconos, in Pennsylvania, very close to the notoriously haunted town of Jim Thorpe. The Poconos area is very well known for the rich Native American heritage and culture that used to thrive there. We rent a house in Towamensing Trails, which is a private community. We call it the Easter House, and it is a very important trip for my family. I am extremely close with all of my cousins, even though we are varied in age. I am the oldest of our pack, and the second oldest is my cousin Morgan, who's my best friend, basically my sister. We believe we are traveling souls. One year, at the Easter House, when we were around 15, we set out with our 3 younger cousins on our annual hike through the woods. We had a secret spot we always went to, which had a river and tiny creeks running through it, and many little pools and islands. We kept venturing through the woods. It was all familiar enough, as we had scoured those woods many times before. We came to a place we recognized about a half-mile in, a thicket of long-growing laurel trees by the river. They're more like bushes, super annoying to try and walk through. They were so thick you could barely see through them. Then, it suddenly became very dark in the forest, like everything had a shadow, even though it was the middle of the day, and we had not ventured into the thick trees. The air became heavy, and everything was silent. No wind, or birds, or animals. It seemed like even the sound of the river had stopped. I knew something was wrong, and then Morgan and I stopped in our tracks and looked at each other at the exact same time. Something was very off. We both felt different things. I felt like there was something animalistic in the trees ahead, something dark and evil, and it wanted to hurt us, possibly eat us. It seemed like a bear maybe, or a twisted form of a human. It's hard to explain how I knew this. It's just how my intuition works. Morgan felt the same. Something evil. She felt that if we went further, it would see us, and there would be no going home. I felt that it knew that we were close, but we had little time. Both of us, without speaking, knew that we needed to bolt fast. We turned in the direction the road was, and looked at our cousins and said, "Run." So we ran our group all the way out of the woods until the dark presence had faded, and we were back at the house. I'd never been scared in the woods like that before. We are all pretty outdoorsy, and don't scare easily. I didn't realize what had happened until I was much older. I am now 26, when I was listening to your podcast and decided to look back on some of my experiences, slowly realizing some of them were quite strange and cannot be rationally explained. Morgan and I did some research on the legends of the Lenape and Delaware tribes that heavily populated the area. We found a legend of a Native American spirit called Mahuwe. Before I read you the description of the spirit, I will note that we wrote down all of what we could remember before we did our research, as to not influence our memories. Mahuwe is a Native American spirit, a giant humanoid man-eating monster that lurks in the forests and attacks anyone who comes close. It is very similar to a Wendigo, and is associated with hunger, cannibalism, and sin. We also found a spirit called Yakwahe, or Yakwawiok, which is a giant hairless bear-like creature that also eats humans. When I think about this encounter, Mahuwe just seems right to me. It's terrifying to think that we possibly ran into something like that in the woods right near our vacation house. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I do know it wasn't just paranoia. Something not right is out in those woods. That community has always been a little spooky, and the people there are strange. They have an odd feel to their energy, as if they're hiding something. Other strange things have happened to us in those woods, like getting lost in circles, even though we knew the area well, finding odd things in the forest where they don't belong, like burned-out foundations of buildings and random household items strewn about deep in the forest, and seeing people walking around in the woods, only to vanish in thin air. And it wasn't like someone had thrown these items out of their car or something. I'm talking miles into the forest. Also, some time glitch stuff has happened as well. I have more stories like this, but I'll leave it at Mahuwe for now. As we got older, experiences diminished, possibly because the area is getting more and more developed and the forest is being knocked down, but that community and that area still has the same ominous feeling. I know I'll never go back to that spot, though. Thanks for listening. All the best, Tracy. As we come to the end of today's episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for listening and supporting the podcast. Until next time, I hope that you all have a healthy and safe week, and I'd like to say thank you to Tori, Jessie, Jacob, Gary, Sebastian, Peyton, Liliana, Gabi, and Tracy for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. You may also visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember that no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. You can also get involved with the podcast by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you're supporting it right now just by listening, and we really appreciate it. You can also help by subscribing to the podcast and by sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to show your support, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries and become a patron. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every week and are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, I'd like to thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.